She's not on the list. Send her away. The guards at the Vatican concert hall didn't even look twice at the refugee girl with the battered violin. But what they didn't know, what the world would soon discover, was that she carried a melody that could silence cathedrals and move popes to tears. This is the breathtaking story of a child who was rejected for being too poor, too foreign, too invisible, until her music lit a fire the world couldn't ignore. From the ashes of war to the heart of the Vatican, witness how one girl turned her pain into purpose, shattered elitism with soul, and became the voice of millions. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. No. I told you already, you can't be here. The guard barked, his voice echoing against the polished marble archways of the Vatican's concert hall entrance. Amira froze mid-step, clutching the wooden case close to her chest, her fingers trembling around the string latch that barely held the cracked violin inside. Her coat was 2 sizes too big, patched at the sleeves and frayed around the hood, its faded blue drowning her small, wiry frame. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came, only a hollow breath of cold air and nerves. "I just wanted to ask about the music," she finally whispered, barely audible above the swell of choir harmonies filtering out from the rehearsal inside. The melody of sacred Latin hymns reached her ears like incense, thick with tradition and untouched elegance, something she had only known from dreams and radio static. "You're not on the list," the guard snapped, eyeing her up and down with a look so sharp it sliced her dignity. "And this isn't a street performance, this is the Vatican." From behind him, a tall man with silver-rimmed glasses and a crimson vestment stepped forward. The choir director, Maestro Vincenzo Bellini. His hands, long and bony like a pianist's, were clasped in front of him, though his eyes carried no warmth, only disdain polished by years of elite gatekeeping. "And what is that in your hands?" he asked, his Italian accent softening the cruelty but not the meaning. "My violin," Amira answered, lifting the case gently. "It's not much, but—" He raised a finger, silencing her. "Do you know where you are, child? This concert is not some village street corner. It is sacred music, played by musicians who have studied for decades. You need technique, poise, nobility of tone, not desperation." She lowered her eyes, her throat tightened, her mouth dry as paper. She had nothing to offer in defense. She couldn't explain what music meant to her in words, not to people like them, who had never played a lullaby under falling bombs, who had never used notes to pray when churches were rubble. A boy in a tuxedo stepped out of the hall just then, his violin polished and gleaming under the Roman sun. He smirked when he saw Amira and whispered to another child beside him. The laughter wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Amira felt it like heat against her skin. The maestro turned. "Please take her away. This is not a shelter." The guard stepped forward again, towering over her. "You heard the man, off the steps." Amira's father, who had been waiting nearby, stepped in quickly and placed his arm around her shoulders. "It's all right, Habibti, let's go." His voice was soft but strained, his beard was peppered with gray, his jacket worn thin like hers. He didn't argue. He never did. Not here. They turned away, slowly descending the steps beneath the ornate pillars that watched like silent judges. Behind her, the doors closed with a hollow thud. Amira didn't cry. Not here. Not now. But something within her cracked, not like a plate shattering loudly on stone, but like the tightening of a string pulled too far. Silent, invisible, but irreversible. They walked past the fountain where pigeons gathered, past the golden gates where tourists posed for photos, oblivious to the sting that clung to Amira's chest. Past the vendors selling rosaries and gelato and postcards of the Pope waving. She wanted to scream, but music had always been her only voice. That night, back at the refugee shelter, Amira sat on her cot with the violin in her lap. The mattress springs poked through the thin fabric, and the air reeked of canned soup and old blankets. She turned her back to the others, families crammed into corners with cardboard walls for privacy, and slowly opened the violin case. It wasn't a real case, not anymore. It had been part of a suitcase, cut and restitched. Inside was a battered violin, the wood darkened with time, scorched slightly on one side, and varnish chipped like peeling paint. The bow was frayed at the edge, but she had tightened the string earlier with a borrowed tuning peg from another boy's broken instrument. She always fixed things with what little she had. That was her music school, war and willpower. She lifted the violin to her shoulder and closed her eyes. The melody started slow, the same lullaby her mother used to hum while braiding her hair. A song without words, built of memory and longing. Her fingers danced gently along the neck, coaxing out notes soft as candlelight. Outside the cracked window, Rome glittered beneath a waxing moon. But inside that shelter, time folded inward. She was back in her old bedroom, back when she had a bed that didn't rock with every movement, back when her mother would whisper stories in between the notes. The bow trembled slightly, but she steadied it. This part, the part where the melody dipped into minor, always reminded her of the night the soldiers came. The sudden silences between notes felt like footsteps in mud. Then came the rise, the swell of defiance, of reaching beyond the wire fences and hunger and borderlines drawn by people who had never met a girl like her. A creak. She opened her eyes. Standing near the door was Sister Eliana, one of the shelter volunteers. She held a tray of medicine, frozen mid-step, eyes wide. "That was," the nun breathed, stepping closer. "Where did you learn that?" Amira lowered the violin slowly. "My mother taught me, back home." "It sounds like grief turned into light." She sat beside her, gently brushing a curl from Amira's cheek. "You should never stop playing." "I wasn't good enough," Amira said. "They told me today. Then they didn't listen." Silence filled the room. The kind of silence that wraps around a child and says, "Stay soft. You're still safe here." Amira nodded once. Sister Eliana stood. "Will you play again tomorrow night?" Amira hesitated. "Maybe." The nun smiled and left, but Amira didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, the lullaby replaying again and again in her mind. The shame of rejection mixed with something deeper, a quiet fire. She didn't know how, but she needed to play again, not for the Vatican, not for the maestro, but for every child who had ever been told their voice didn't belong on sacred ground. What she didn't know, what no one could have known, was that the world had already heard her. That just hours ago, a seminarian named Luca had walked by the shelter and paused outside the door. He had filmed the end of her song, not for any reason but instinct. And that night, unable to sleep, he posted it online with a simple caption: "She plays like the sky is listening." The video was already spreading like wildfire across Rome, and by morning, it would reach a man in white robes. A man burdened by the weight of a broken world. A man who understood the language of music better than many realized. A man called the Pope. The violin had not always been broken. Once it gleamed beneath the amber light of their little home in Aleppo, a tiny apartment above a once bustling bakery where the scent of cinnamon and fresh pita would drift in through their cracked window. Amira remembered the way sunlight danced across the polished wood, while her mother tuned it with practiced fingers and a hum that lived somewhere between song and prayer. "Music," her mother would whisper, brushing a gentle kiss to Amira's temple, "is what God uses to breathe when he can't speak." It was there, in that tiny room surrounded by dust and jasmine, that Amira first learned to draw sound from silence. She didn't need formal training. She didn't need theory books or a music stand. All she needed was her mother's warmth, her father's steady rhythm tapping on the table beside her, and the city outside, crying, laughing, rising, crumbling. They would sit on a floor cushioned together, Amira's legs folded beneath her, the violin balanced on her shoulder as she mimicked the way her mother's fingers glided across the strings. Her first sounds were squeaky, stubborn, fragile things, but her mother never winced. She smiled through every off-key screech and whispered, "Again, again, until it becomes a river." And it did. Then came the night everything changed. She remembered it not in flashes of horror, but in strange, frozen details. The way her glass of milk tipped over and spilled down the wooden table like a ghost. The way her father's radio cut off mid-news bulletin. The shuddering silence that preceded the blast. And then the sound. Explosions didn't sound like movies. They didn't roar. They cracked. They split the world open like an egg dropped on concrete. And once the windows shattered and the bakery downstairs erupted into flame, Amira's mother shoved her into the corner, covering her body with her own. When she opened her eyes, her world had vanished. The apartment was gone. The violin lay in the rubble, singed along the edge, half buried in ash. Her mother's arms were no longer around her. Amira never saw her again. In the days that followed, the city became smoke and sirens. Her father, bloodied but breathing, pulled her through streets she barely recognized. He carried her when she couldn't walk, sang when she couldn't cry. They joined the others, hundreds, thousands, entire families reduced to blankets and bags, trudging toward a border that was never truly open. Amira didn't speak much after that, but she held the violin to her chest like a relic, even when it burned her hands. Even when they told her to leave it behind. Too heavy. You'll need both arms for the boat. But the sea did not swallow them. They reached Italy weeks later, by raft, by miracle, by the sheer will of fathers like hers, who had nothing left but their children and memories. They were processed like cattle, lined up, documented, and herded into camps that smelled of steel and bleach and loss. No one cared where she had come from. No one asked about the violin. Yet even there, in that strange in-between place where refugees are seen but not heard, Amira played. She fixed the neck of the violin with fishing line and borrowed glue from a kind volunteer. Her bow had splintered on the raft, so she scavenged a replacement from a broken curtain rod and the loose hairs of a toy horse discarded in the trash. Every day, she would sit outside the wire fence and play a little, for herself, for the children who cried in their sleep, for the memory of her mother. Sometimes guards paused, sometimes they even smiled. But no one ever asked her name, not until Sister Eliana. Sister Eliana had arrived at the camp like a drop of rain on cracked earth. She brought books, toothbrushes, real bread, but more than that, she brought softness. She never looked at them like a problem. She sat with Amira under the moon one night and asked about the song she played, the one that sounded like a heartbeat, quiet but stubborn. "My mother made it up," Amira had said. "It doesn't have words." "Even better," the nun whispered. "That means you still get to decide what it means." And then one day, word came that the Vatican would host a concert, a sacred event for world peace. One that would feature the most talented youth performers in all of Europe. There would be choirs, orchestras, and even a soloist chosen to play before the Pope himself. Auditions would be limited, and names had to be submitted in advance. Sister Eliana tried. She wrote letters, made phone calls, but when she mentioned Amira's background, her lack of citizenship, her absence from any conservatory, the responses were polite and final. Such events must maintain their standards. Still, Amira went. She didn't expect to be chosen, but she had hoped perhaps for the chance to be heard, just once. Not as a refugee, not as a tragedy, but as a girl who could make a piece of wood and string sound like healing. Instead, she was turned away at the gates. Now, back at the shelter, as Rome exhaled the last light of day and stars gathered in scattered applause above the domes, Amira sat in her bunk, plucking strings in silence. Her father snored softly nearby, exhausted from his shift at the port. Around her, families rustled in sleep. But Amira remained awake, her fingers remembering each note even when her hope could not. Far away, in a small Vatican office adorned with gold-framed paintings and dusty scrolls, a young seminarian named Luca sat scrolling through his phone. He was studying theology by candlelight when the video appeared, shared by a friend of a friend. It was grainy, low resolution, but the sound, he turned the volume up. The violin's song poured out like water through stone. It wasn't technical, it wasn't perfect, but it was alive, raw, aching, and utterly holy. It was the sound of a soul remembering how to breathe. Luca stood, unsure what compelled him, and walked through the corridor until he reached the private library reserved for senior clergy. There, late into the night, Pope Clement XIV sat reading letters from displaced children. The Holy Father looked up as Luca entered, confused by the interruption. "Your Holiness," Luca said, bowing deeply, "forgive me, but you must hear something." The Pope gestured softly. Luca offered the phone, hands trembling. As the first notes played, the Pope said nothing. He simply closed his eyes. He listened to the lullaby rise, falter, and bloom again, each phrase like a scar that refused to close. When the last note faded, he opened his eyes slowly. "She has no name," he asked. "No, Your Holiness. Just a refugee girl from the shelter by the Tiber." Silence. The Pope stood. "Then find her," he said, his voice firm but reverent, "and bring her to me, for a song like that does not come from the streets. It comes from heaven." The city slept beneath a silver fog. Street lamps glowed like quiet sentinels, their golden light bleeding through the mist as if the air itself had grown soft with dreaming. Rome, so often alive with footsteps and voices, now hushed itself to a whisper, save for the distant hum of a passing tram and the murmur of water in ancient fountains. And beneath the columns of the Vatican's outer courtyard, in a shadowed alcove few bothered to glance toward, a small figure emerged once more. Amira. She wore the same oversized coat, but the hood was pulled down this time, exposing the wild curls the wind loved to tangle. Her breath floated visibly in the cold, brief clouds of nervous warmth. In her hands, clutched tightly like something sacred, was the old violin. She carried it, not with arrogance, not with entitlement, but with the quiet reverence of someone holding a memory too delicate to speak aloud. She had returned. Not to confront, not to beg, but to play. Because the ache inside her had grown too loud. She settled herself on the edge of the stone ledge where pilgrims often sat to pray, and for a moment her eyes scanned the plaza. Empty, perfect. No choir director, no judgment, no stage, only the sky above and the echoing stillness of stone beneath her feet. She lifted the violin to her shoulder. Her bow hovered in midair, just long enough for her to offer one more silent prayer. Not for an audience, not even for a future. Just for clarity, for release. And then she began. The sound came gently, almost shyly, like sunlight peeking through a tear in storm clouds. A soft opening phrase, delicate as lace, drifting outward through the courtyard in fragile waves. The melody was not one of triumph or grandeur. It was a lament. A slow, aching descent into memory, a song woven from longing, stitched with the thread of exile. Her fingers danced along the strings, nimble despite the cold. Every note she played carried pieces of a home she could no longer return to. The broken laughter of her cousins, the scent of saffron rising from the pot her mother used to stir, the rhythm of prayer that once echoed through stone alleyways now buried beneath dust. The music curved downward, dipped low, then slowly rose, as if catching breath after sorrow. It was not a performance. It was a confession. And though the Vatican courtyard was nearly empty, she was not alone. A nun paused near the chapel steps, drawn by something she couldn't name. Then a tourist couple wandered closer, clutching their map, their conversation falling silent. A Swiss guard on evening patrol halted mid-step, one hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, the other dropping to his side. The notes kept flowing. The violin now wept openly, its voice richer than the scars in its wood suggested. Amira leaned into it, her eyes closed, her lips parted slightly as if breathing in each note before setting it free. More people gathered. Not many, just a few. A trickle. A slow, reverent audience that kept their distance, yet could not turn away. They didn't speak, didn't whisper. They only listened, to a melody that spoke in the language of what the world tries to bury, but never quite silences. Sister Eliana arrived last, still wearing her apron, hands dusted with flour. She gasped softly when she saw the girl in the shadows, saw the instrument rise and fall like a wounded bird refusing to stay grounded. She wanted to rush in, to place her hand on the girl's shoulder, but something in the stillness stopped her. This moment wasn't hers to interrupt. She stood quietly behind the growing cluster of souls, tears already forming in the corners of her eyes. In all her years she'd never heard something so broken sound so complete. Then, like all things beautiful and brief, the final note arrived. It didn't crash or crescendo. It faded, slowly, like the last heartbeat of a fading star. Silence followed, and in that silence something holy occurred. Not applause, not cheering, just stillness. A breathless stillness so deep it felt like the whole world bowed its head. Amira lowered her bow. Her chest rose and fell like she'd just run a marathon inside her soul. She looked up, and only then noticed the crowd. A flicker of panic crossed her eyes, but it vanished the moment she saw Sister Eliana smiling behind them. From the crowd, someone clapped once, then twice. Then a soft ripple of hands followed, uncertain but sincere. A man stepped forward. The same seminarian who had filmed her earlier. He looked at her with the wonder of someone realizing he had captured a comet. "That was yours?" he asked gently. Amira nodded once, unsure of what to say. "May I share it? Your song?" She hesitated. Sister Eliana stepped forward and knelt beside her. "You don't have to if you don't want to," she said softly. Amira looked at the violin in her lap. She remembered her mother's hands guiding hers. Remembered the first time she played that lullaby beneath the sound of shelling. And in that memory, there was no audience, no spotlight, only the need to be heard by something bigger than the moment. She met the seminarian's eyes and nodded again. Yes, you can share it. He smiled in gratitude, not for himself, but for what the world would soon hear. The crowd began to drift. One by one, people walked away, holding the moment like a secret inside their chests. A young woman wiped her eyes with her scarf. A priest crossed himself. A man in a suit lingered just long enough to whisper, "Thank you," before disappearing into the mist. Only Sister Eliana and Amira remained. The nun took the girl's hands in hers. "You did something tonight," she whispered. "Something that will outlive even the stones." Amira looked up toward the stars peeking through the mist. They didn't seem so far away now. The video was posted that night. No caption, no clickbait, just the simple words. She played like the sky was listening, and within hours it began to spread. Across the corridors of seminaries and cathedrals, across the phones of teenagers in cramped apartments, across refugee camps and elite conservatories. The world didn't know who she was, didn't know her name, her past, her journey. But they knew the sound, and it broke them open in the best possible way. In the morning, as Amira slept, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, the Vatican was already stirring. The Pope's aides, overwhelmed by the flood of messages and reposts, brought the video to His Holiness just after sunrise. He watched it without speaking. When the last note faded, the Pope leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He was silent for a long time. Then he opened them slowly and spoke the words that would change everything. "She carries the breath of angels," he said, "and yet the world told her she was unworthy." He turned to his aide. "Prepare the car, we are going to find her." The sun rose gently over Rome, soft as a sigh. Golden light spilled across the cobbled streets, draping the statues in soft halos and catching on the worn bricks of ancient chapels. The city stirred, not with noise but with reverence, as if even its breath was slowed by the grace of something unseen but imminent. Inside the apostolic palace, the halls were quieter than usual. The usual rhythm of cardinals pacing and secretaries shuffling parchment had dimmed to whispers. Something had shifted. In his private chambers, Pope Clement XIV stood by the window in silence. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting long shadows across the ornate floor tiles. But he wasn't looking at the grandeur of St. Peter's Square. His eyes were fixed inward. He had watched the video 3 times. He knew the sound of manufactured beauty. He had heard operas gilded in ego and hymns polished until the soul had been scrubbed away. But this was the opposite. That girl's music had cracks in it, not in pitch but in spirit, like stained glass fractured by grief and still managing to let the light through. She had not played to impress. She had played because her soul could no longer hold the silence. And the world had listened. He turned slowly to his aide, Father Matteo, who stood respectfully with a tablet in hand, eyes down. "Where is she?" the Pope asked. Father Matteo cleared his throat, voice reverent but unsure. "The girl is unnamed in the video, Your Holiness, but several viewers identified the background as the refugee housing complex near the Tiber. There's a shelter run by Sister Eliana. We believe the child is staying there." The Pope nodded once, decisive. "Tell the driver, we leave within the hour." Father Matteo's eyes widened. "Your Holiness, if I may, this isn't protocol. We can send someone on your behalf, arrange a private meeting." "No," the word was firm, but not loud. "This child has already been turned away by men who thought themselves gatekeepers of holiness. I will not become one of them. If she is a prophet in rags, then I will go to her as a pilgrim." The aide bowed, humbled into silence. 40 minutes later, the Pope's modest motorcade pulled away from the Vatican gates, not with trumpets, not with guards in formation, but with quiet purpose. A black Fiat, not the usual armored Cadillac. 2 aides, no photographers, only the sound of tires over ancient stone. The journey was short, but to the residents of the shelter, it might as well have been a miracle crossing the threshold of reality. Sister Eliana was mending a blanket when she saw the car pull up. Her eyes narrowed first in confusion, then widened in disbelief. She dropped the fabric and hurried toward the door as the vehicle rolled to a stop. The back door opened slowly. And there he stood, The Holy Father, in plain white robes, his zucchetto catching the light, his face warm and weathered like old parchment that had known both fire and rain. Children stopped playing. Mothers froze mid-conversation. Even the pigeons seemed to pause in flight. He stepped forward gently, not with ceremony, but with humanity. He looked not at the rows of curious eyes or the whispered gasps. He scanned the faces quietly, searching. Sister Eliana stepped forward, hands clasped tightly. "Your Holiness," she breathed, struggling to comprehend. "This is an honor we never dreamed." "Where is the girl who plays the violin like prayer?" he asked softly. There was no hesitation in her answer. "She's inside, still asleep. Her name is Amira." He nodded, then looked around at the gathering crowd. "May I meet her?" Sister Eliana guided him through the narrow hallway, past stacked cots and the soft rustle of blankets. They reached the small corner where Amira lay curled, her violin beside her like a faithful companion. Her lashes fluttered. The room still carried the scent of lentils and dust and faint echoes of lullabies. Eliana leaned in. "Amira," she whispered gently, "there's someone here who would like to meet you." The girl stirred, confused at first, then sat up slowly. Her eyes, still fogged with sleep, widened as they landed on the figure standing in the doorway. He didn't speak. He only offered a soft smile and lowered himself to one knee, not as a sovereign but as a seeker. Amira blinked, uncertain. "Are you the Pope?" His smile widened. "And you are the girl whose music found me when nothing else could." She looked down, embarrassed. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." He shook his head. "You caused no trouble, child. You reminded the world how to listen." There was a silence then, deep and trembling. The kind of silence that carries the weight of understanding. He extended a hand, and she hesitated, then placed hers in his. His fingers were old, lined with age and papal rings, yet his grip was warm and fatherly. "Would you play for me?" he asked. Her mouth opened, closed again. "Here? Anywhere." The Pope rose slowly. "But if you would prefer a different place, come with me." She didn't know what she was agreeing to when she nodded. An hour later, Amira found herself inside the same Vatican concert hall whose doors had once shut her out. But this time, no guards pushed her back. No director turned up his nose. The heavy doors opened wide, and the marble echoed with the sound of her footfalls as she stepped through, violin in hand. The Pope walked beside her. The pews were empty except for a few nuns, aides, and stunned choir boys lingering in the gallery above. The hall, designed for perfection, now stood in reverent wait, not for fame or spectacle, but for a girl in a tattered coat and a cracked violin. She took her place beneath the ornate dome. Her heart thudded against her ribs. Her fingers trembled as they touched the strings. But when she looked up and saw him, the man who had come for her, sitting alone in the center pew with his eyes closed, waiting, her breath stilled. She lifted the bow, and she played. She played not like a refugee, not like a child, not even like a musician. She played like a spirit rising. The sound that spilled out was no longer just a lullaby. It was a cry, a hymn, a call to every corner of the world that had forgotten what it meant to feel something raw and unfiltered. The acoustics of the hall embraced each note like a mother receiving her child. The air shimmered with grief, resilience, and something utterly transcendent. When the last note fell, it did not land with finality. It landed like a seed. Silence. Then breath. And the Pope, eyes wet with quiet tears, stood slowly and whispered one sentence. "This hall has never held a holier sound." For a few fleeting hours, it felt like the world had changed. Amira walked the cobblestone path away from the Vatican Hall with her father at her side, her violin pressed against her chest as though it had just been baptized. The Pope's words still echoed in her mind like bells. This hall has never held a holier sound. She didn't know what it meant, what would come next. All she knew was that, for the first time, the doors hadn't closed on her. They had opened. They returned to the shelter that afternoon to find Sister Eliana weeping in the courtyard, her hands shaking as she held a printed screenshot in her hands. It was the thumbnail of the now viral video. Amira, eyes closed, fingers poised, bow in motion. And beneath it, numbers spinning into the millions. "You've touched the world, Habibti," Eliana whispered, pulling her into an embrace. "They're calling you La Bambina dell'Anima, the soulful child." By nightfall, news vans were parking outside the refugee shelter. Reporters appeared with microphones and overexcited cameramen. Volunteers tried to hold them back as children stared from behind curtained windows. Journalists shouted questions in 3 different languages. Who is she? Where is she from? What's her real name? Is it true the Pope requested a private concert? Amira stayed hidden in a back room, her hands curled in her sleeves, trying not to be afraid of the light that now poured through the cracks. Father gently pressed his hand on her shoulder. You don't have to go out there. But she shook her head. I'm not afraid. I don't want to be something I'm not. Then stay who you are, he said, and let the world rise to meet you. By morning, the invitations came, not just from Vatican officials, but from embassies, orchestras, music conservatories, even record labels. They all wanted to speak with the girl who made the Pope cry. They all wanted a piece of the story now that it was dipped in gold. Among the offers, one name stood out. The Vatican Concert Committee. The very committee that had rejected her, whose members had not seen her play but had heard the buzz growing like thunder around her name. They extended a formal invitation for her to return, this time to attend the Vatican's peace concert, not as an outsider, not as a trespasser, but as a guest of honor. It felt surreal, the same ornate hall, the same looming pillars. But now her name was on a printed program, 4th line, solo interlude. She was to play the same lullaby, the one now being whispered in churches and kindergartens across Europe. The same song that had once lived only in her mother's breath. Sister Eliana found a simple dress for her, ivory with blue embroidery, gently sewn to fit her small frame. Her father bought her new shoes with his week's wages. They didn't fit perfectly, but they were hers. She looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the girl staring back. The day of the concert arrived, and with it, a different kind of silence. A silence not of reverence, but of scrutiny. The backstage area buzzed with the rustle of silk and the sound of tuning instruments. Children from across the world stood in clusters, some with chaperones in tailored suits, some with teachers whispering last-minute encouragement. Amira stood alone, violin in hand, waiting for someone to guide her. Then she saw him again. Maestro Vincenzo Bellini, the same choir director who had dismissed her as not belonging. He was speaking with another official, his hands animated, his voice low and urgent. He turned and saw her, and for a fraction of a second, surprise flickered across his face. Then it hardened into something else. Recognition. And then, rejection. He approached. Miss Amira, is it? He asked, the name rolling off his tongue as though it were foreign. I trust you are prepared? She nodded quietly. His eyes scanned her attire, her old violin case, her trembling hands. His smile was thin. Good, but you should know, he added in a tone too calm, there's been a change. A change? He gestured to the schedule pinned on the board. Her name was no longer in the solo section. Instead, it had been moved, pushed to the end, rebranded as an optional interlude during closing prayer. She blinked. Why? There were concerns, he said, voice silked with faux regret. This is a sacred event, child. There were questions raised about consistency. You're talented, no doubt, but untrained, and many have traveled far to hear precision, not improvisation. Amira's throat tightened. But the Pope? The Pope has a generous heart, he interrupted gently, but we must also think of the sanctity of the music. We cannot let emotion override excellence. Her hands went cold. He placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture anything but kind. It's still a privilege to be here, you understand. Just play softly and try not to draw too much attention. He walked away before she could answer. She stood frozen, eyes locked on the list of names. A hierarchy of heritage, lineage, and legacy. The message was clear. She was allowed to be present, but not to shine. The hall filled, cameras rolled. The Pope arrived quietly, seated without fanfare, his gaze wandering often toward the side entrance as though searching for someone. Amira waited in the wings. She heard the choir rise, the organs swell. She heard the practiced crescendos of children born into opportunity, their notes clean, correct, cold. She was supposed to walk on stage during the closing reflection. But as the minutes passed, the tone of the concert changed. It became clear the interlude might not even happen, that the optional was becoming disposable. No one called her name, no one made space. And for the second time, she stood in the hall she had once filled with spirit, and realized they were pushing her out again. This time, with smiles. this time with silence. Sister Eliana watched from the crowd, her fists clenched, heart-burning, but she said nothing. Because to stand up now would risk making Amira a headline instead of a girl. And still, the Pope watched the side entrance. Watched it until the final hymn faded and Amira's song never came. Until quietly he rose, not in applause, not in ceremony, but in sorrow. The applause thundered, but it rang hollow in the Pope's ears. The choir had just finished its final Latin hymn, and the audience inside the Vatican concert hall rose in perfect synchronization, like a choreographed sea of approval. But Pope Clement XIV did not clap. He remained seated in the front pew, motionless, the expression on his face unreadable, save for the faint tightening of his jaw and the crease forming between his brow. The maestro stood tall on stage, basking in his moment, arms gracefully spread like a conductor before an invisible orchestra. His polished shoes clicked on the marble as he turned to acknowledge the dignitaries seated along the front row. But his eyes briefly flicked toward the side entrance, then away. Still, no Amira. Not one note from her bow had been heard. Not one breath of her music had filled the space. Though her name had been printed, however low, however buried, the moment she was promised had been stolen in silence. They didn't need to say no this time. They simply never said go. The Pope's fingers traced the edge of his chair's armrest, each slow movement like the ticking of a clock winding toward revelation. Around him, murmurs of contentment rose. Guests stood, chatted, snapped photos of the choir children. A reporter whispered to a colleague, "A flawless performance." Another nodded, "Masterful, safe as expected." Safe, the Pope stood, not in ceremony, not in dismissal, but in something deeper, older, a solemn resolve that stirred from the root of his being. He did not address the crowd. He did not wait for attention. He simply turned away from the main aisle and walked, not toward the exit, but toward the shadows of the side entrance, where a girl in a white dress stood with her violin still untouched in her arms. Amira had been watching from behind the curtain, not crying, not trembling, just still. A stillness that came from a soul too tired to protest injustice it already knew by name. The light had been offered, then slowly drawn away, like a window shut by hands she could never reach. She saw him approach, the Pope in white, gliding through the corridor, as if led not by footsteps, but by purpose. He reached her and paused, looking down at her with eyes that held no pity, only gravity, and the kind of warmth that burned away shame. "I waited for your song," he said softly. Amira's lips parted, her voice barely a whisper. They said, "It wasn't necessary." A silence. Then the Pope looked past her toward the stage where the choir was lining up for bows and photographers snapped their final flashes. His gaze lingered not in anger, but in disappointment, carved deep as scripture. "Would you still be willing to play?" he asked. She blinked, confused. "Now? Now? They've finished." "No," he said, his voice low and powerful. "You haven't." And with that, he turned and walked directly onto the stage. The hall gasped. Cameras turned. The maestro, mid-bow, froze in place as the Holy Father stepped beside him, placing a gentle but unshakable hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for your service, Maestro Bellini," the Pope said calmly into the microphone. "But there is one performance yet unheard." The audience looked around, confused. Whispers darted like birds in flight. The Pope gestured to the side door. And slowly, from the shadows, Amira stepped into the light. She didn't walk like a guest. She didn't walk like a soloist. She walked like a girl summoned by something she could hardly believe was real, guided by trust in the one man who had never looked away. The hall fell into silence. Amira crossed the stage. The spotlight adjusted to her height, smaller than the others who had taken the stage before her, thinner, her shoes slightly too big, her dress simple. She paused, glanced once at the Pope, and he nodded. No notes, no introduction, no grandeur. Just her. She raised the violin to her chin and played. The first note rose like a question, hesitant, trembling, but impossibly pure. It lingered in the rafters like the first light after a long eclipse. Then came the second note, fuller. The third, bolder. The melody began to shape itself, slow and sacred, as though the very marble beneath their feet was holding its breath. There were no backing vocals, no accompaniment, only a cracked violin and a child who had once been told she did not belong here. But now, she was not asking permission. She was declaring presence. The lullaby, born of ash and memory, unfolded into something transcendent. It rose above politics, beyond tradition. Each note told the story of a girl who had fled war, who had crossed oceans on rafts, who had been turned away at cathedrals and told to quiet the holiness inside her. But now, in this hall meant for angels, she played the voice of every child who had ever been silenced. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman sobbed quietly. A bishop crossed himself without thinking. A choir boy whispered to another, "It sounds like crying, but beautiful." When Amira reached the part where the song dipped into mourning, her eyes fluttered shut. She remembered her mother, the warm hands, the hum under her breath, the kiss on her brow. Her bow slowed, her breath caught. And then she soared. The final crescendo wasn't loud. It didn't shout. It glowed. It swelled like a heart mending from within, then faded so gently it felt as if the music had simply been a dream shared by everyone at once. Silence. Then from the center of the hall, the Pope stood and began to clap, not slowly, not gently, but with force, with conviction. The entire room followed. The sound of hands meeting hands echoed like thunder in a cathedral, not for fame, not for novelty, but for truth. The Pope stepped forward again and embraced her, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. Then he turned to the stunned audience. "This child," he said, "was rejected for not fitting the mold. But she reminded us today that God does not live in perfection. God lives in fire, in broken wood, in the trembling bow of a child who has every reason to give up and chooses instead to play." He turned to the maestro, whose face was pale and rigid. "The Church does not gatekeep grace," the Pope continued. "Nor should its servants. When a soul sings, we listen, or we lose our own." The crowd was silent, then standing, then weeping. In that moment, Amira was not just a refugee, not a guest, not even a performer. She was a revelation. The video began spreading before she even left the stage. Someone in the front row had captured it. Not the whole performance, just the last minute. The trembling notes, the child's silhouette under the ancient dome. The moment the Pope stood and began to applaud. That 37-second clip was posted with a caption that said simply, "A refugee child just silenced the Vatican with a single song." Within 20 minutes, it had 50,000 views. Within an hour, it was everywhere. The Vatican's press office scrambled to issue a statement, but the world had already written its own. Comment threads overflowed in a dozen languages. News anchors in glass studios used words like miraculous, historic, undeniable. Theories surged about who she was, where she had come from, what would happen now. But one truth rang through all of it. Something holy had happened. That night, Amira and her father returned to the shelter on foot, though the Pope had offered them a private car. They declined. Amira didn't say much, only held his hand, her violin case dangling from her shoulder like an old friend. "Did I do something wrong?" she whispered, her voice too soft to carry past the wind. "No," her father said, stopping to kneel before her in the middle of the cobbled street. "You did what your mother dreamed of every night she survived. You made the world listen." The shelter had changed. Its gates, once ignored by the world, were now watched by reporters, tourists, and curious pilgrims. Someone had left a bouquet of white lilies at the entrance. A child's drawing hung from the fence, a stick-figure girl with a halo made of violin strings. Inside, Sister Eliana wept when she saw them. She didn't speak, just took Amira into her arms and held her like a mother would. That night, they sat in the common room with the television glowing quietly in the corner. A special broadcast interrupted the usual programming. It was the Pope. His voice, gentle and measured, echoed through homes and cathedrals alike. "There are children," he began, "who carry pain heavier than most kings ever will. There are melodies forged not in conservatories, but in camps and rubble. And sometimes one of them walks into a place where no one expects beauty, and beauty bows in return." He paused, looking into the camera. To all those who heard her, "Remember that we do not elevate others out of charity, we elevate them out of justice." In the days that followed, letters arrived from around the globe. A school in Chicago played her lullaby over the intercom. A boy in Syria made a violin out of scraps and named it Amira. A woman in Spain created a mural, Amira standing barefoot in the Vatican, with 1,000 invisible strings rising from her violin into the sky. But even as the world applauded, Amira stayed quiet. She still rose early, still washed her father's work shirts in the sink, still played her violin at dusk, though now others joined her in the courtyard. Children who once saw music as unreachable now hummed in harmony. The shelter began to sound like something living, breathing, healing. Offers began to pour in: elite music schools, conservatories, talent agencies with rehearsed smiles. Each letter folded in cream envelopes with silver crests and embossed seals. We would be honored to host the young maestro in the making. We are prepared to offer a full scholarship pending audition. We believe this child's talent deserves a world stage. Sister Eliana read them aloud with measured care, but Amira rarely replied. It wasn't pride. It was something deeper. A fear that accepting the spotlight might smother the song inside her. That the world would now try to shape her into something digestible, polished, marketable. She didn't want to be a brand. She just wanted to play her mother's lullaby without permission. Then one day, a different letter came. Not gold-trimmed, not from an institution, just a folded piece of paper, hand-delivered by one of the Vatican's younger priests. It read, "Dear Amira, if you would allow me the honor, I would like to visit you again. No cameras, no press, just us. I would like to speak to you about something important, not as a pope, but as a man who was once a boy with a piano in a war-torn country. With respect, Clement," she said yes. The meeting was held in the garden behind the shelter. There, between rows of lavender and wild rosemary, the Pope arrived without entourage, only a single aide who waited respectfully by the gate. Amira was sitting on a stone bench, violin beside her, head tilted toward the sky. "You remind me of my mother," he said as he sat beside her. "She sang the Psalms while we hid in basements." Amira looked at him. "Were you afraid?" "Terrified," he said with a smile, but her voice turned the dark into something smaller. They sat in silence for a while. Then he turned to her with seriousness in his eyes. "Music is a gift," he said, "but so is defiance. You have both, and they must serve each other. So I want to ask you something." She blinked, unsure. "How would you feel," he asked slowly, "about creating something that belongs to children like you? A place where refugee children can learn music from others like you. Not to polish themselves into something else, but to remember who they are." She said nothing, then nodded. He continued, "The Vatican will fund it, but it will carry your name, not mine, because you are the one who reminded us what sacred music truly sounds like." Her hand trembled as she reached for her violin. "You want me to teach?" she asked. "I want you to lead," he answered. And for the first time in days, she smiled, not out of surprise, not even joy, but something fiercer. Readiness. They called it the lullaby of light. The idea began as a whisper, a small conversation between the Pope and his closest advisors, spoken with care behind closed doors. But as the days passed, the vision grew louder. The Vatican would host another concert, not to showcase power or tradition, but to honor the soul behind the melody that had moved the world. This time, the concert would not feature choirs of privilege or rehearsed pageantry. It would belong to those who had once been silenced. Children from war zones, slums, and border camps, each carrying not only instruments but stories etched into their hands like staves of forgotten songs. And at the heart of it all would be Amira. Word spread like spring wind. One by one, refugee children from across continents began to arrive in Rome. Small hands dragging cases patched with duct tape, flutes stored in cloth bags, fingers that had never touched ivory keys but had learned to coax music from cracked tin lids and plastic water jugs. Each one came with nothing polished, but everything real. The Vatican opened its doors. The very marble halls that had once echoed only with the voices of centuries-old hymns now filled with laughter, with different languages dancing through the air, with off-key rehearsals and shared meals under olive trees. Nuns stitched uniforms by hand. Priests taught theory under sun-dappled archways. The Swiss Guard, usually so stoic, carried boxes of sheet music and helped tune violins. And Amira, she was not just the soloist anymore. She was the soul of the movement. Each morning, she rose before dawn, barefoot in the practice hall, running scales in the silence. Then she helped the other children, showing a boy from Gaza how to hold his cello properly, helping a girl from the Congo learn how to find middle C on a keyboard that had half its keys chipped. She taught not from a pedestal, but from the ground, always level with the ones who needed her most. Still, she hadn't played her mother's lullaby since that night. Not once. The world was hungry for it. Reporters begged for it. Audiences waited, and composers tried to replicate its pattern, searching for the magic they didn't understand. But she held it close. Because some things aren't meant to be repeated until the world is ready to listen with new ears. The night of the concert arrived. The square outside the Vatican swelled beyond capacity. Giant screens were erected in refugee camps across Europe and the Middle East. Cathedrals held watch parties. Journalists compared it to the moon landing, something historic, something transcendent. But inside the concert hall, no one wore tuxedos. There were no red carpets, just folding chairs, candlelight, and children. Amira stood in the wings, her dress simple, her violin newly repaired, not replaced. She had refused to accept a new one. This one carried the journey, she told the luthier. Let it finish it. She peered through the curtain. Among the audience sat ambassadors, aid workers, cardinals, schoolchildren, factory workers, and 3 other popes from different denominations. But front row, just to the left, sat a woman in her 70s holding a single daisy in her lap. She wasn't famous. She was a grandmother from Tunisia who had sold her sewing machine to send her grandson, a tiny drummer, to Rome. Her presence mattered more to Amira than any dignitary. Then the lights dimmed. The Pope walked on stage and raised a hand, not to command, but to calm. There are moments, he began, when history doesn't need to be written, it only needs to be heard. Then he stepped aside. Amira walked forward, a single spotlight guiding her feet across the polished floor. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply bowed, deep and slow, and took her place on the stool in the center of the stage. Behind her, the other children formed a half-circle, flutes, drums, violins, and voices. But she would begin alone. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since that night, she lifted her bow and began the lullaby. The first note sounded like memory returning. It rang out soft and slow, rising from the wood like incense from a forgotten chapel. The hall quieted, the world quieted. Even breath became reverence. This was not the same version the Pope had heard. It was deeper now, older, wiser. She played not just her own sorrow, but theirs. Every child behind her. Every voice swallowed by displacement. Every parent who kissed a forehead before letting go forever. Her fingers moved with precision, but her heart moved with abandon. The song wove through grief, then hope. It shivered through chords of forgiveness, then soared. Not loudly, but luminously. And when the lullaby reached its most fragile phrase, she let go of the bow completely and began to hum, a single trembling note. Then behind her, the chorus of refugee children joined in. Voices rose in harmony, not perfect, not polished, but pure. Some sang in Arabic, some in French, others in Swahili, Hindi, Pashto. But the melody was the same. A lullaby turned into a lantern. The final chord arrived, a soft cascade of strings, her bow returning for one last breath of sound. It faded into nothing. The room did not erupt in applause. No one dared. The Pope stood slowly, hands at his side, and whispered into the stillness, "Now, the concert is complete." Only then did the audience rise, not in noise, in prayer. Some held hands, others wept openly. A man in the back collapsed to his knees and bowed his head. The world, for a breathless moment, had no country, no border, no politics, only music, only Amira. And in that silence, something shifted, not just in Rome, but everywhere. He watched her with folded arms, but his hands trembled. From the shadows of the balcony, Maestro Vincenzo Bellini remained seated long after the audience had risen to its feet. His chair, once reserved for revered conductors and honored guests, now felt too large for him, as though the room had grown taller and the music no longer answered to his standards. Below him, applause swelled like ocean waves. Not thunderous, not frenzied, but slow and rising like the sound of something sacred being remembered. It wasn't performance they were honoring. It was truth. Truth wrapped in a frail girl's hands, truth carried through a scarred violin, truth hummed in the voice of children who had seen more war than most nations could bear to read about. Bellini's eyes stayed locked on Amira, now bowing humbly, her hands trembling, but not from fear, from release. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She was never meant to return. He had made sure of it, had pulled strings, whispered doubts, restructured the order of performances so precisely that her moment would be overlooked, if not erased. But he hadn't accounted for the one man in the room who bowed to no politics. He hadn't accounted for the Pope. Bellini remained still as the concert ended and people began to file out. Some walked in silence, others held each other. One nun knelt in the aisle, eyes closed, whispering a prayer that sounded suspiciously like a thank you. The maestro rose, slowly, like an old monument losing its foundation. Outside, the courtyard was full of murmurs and music students sketching fragments of Amira's melody onto crumpled programs. A reporter recognized him and approached with a microphone. "Maestro Bellini," she said gently, "how did it feel? Seeing her play after everything?" He looked at her, his jaw tightening, but the words didn't come. He shook his head, lifted a gloved hand, and walked away. The world had turned, and he hadn't moved with it. For decades he had sculpted perfection from marble children, selecting only the most polished prodigies, discarding any who showed too much soul and not enough discipline. He had raised musicians like statues, beautiful and cold, taught them to memorize rather than feel, to impress, not to reveal. And now one girl, a barefoot refugee with no pedigree, had dismantled the altar he'd spent his life building. That night, Bellini returned to his flat. It was immaculate, a place of quiet silverware and untouched wine glasses. He sat before his grand piano, opened the lid, and stared at the keys. His fingers hovered above middle C, but nothing came. No melody, no spark. Only the echo of a lullaby he didn't compose, couldn't understand, and would never forget. The next morning, an article appeared in Il Messaggero, a quiet editorial by an anonymous Vatican insider. It described the history of the Vatican Concert Committee, the barriers placed before children like Amira, the politics that tried to choke out beauty. And then, like sunlight through cloud, it praised what had finally changed. "Let it be known," it read, "that greatness was never meant to be curated by gatekeepers, but revealed by the unexpected." The maestro's name wasn't printed, but he saw himself in every word. The following week, he submitted his resignation. Not with a speech, not with ceremony. He left a letter in the choir room beneath a folded crimson vestment and walked away without a second glance. But something happened that he didn't expect. A week later, he received a letter from Amira. It was handwritten, folded carefully, and slipped beneath the door of his old office. It read, "Dear Maestro Bellini, I know you didn't believe in me, but I want you to know I still believe in music, and I believe in second chances, if not for me, then for others like me who will come after. If you ever want to teach again, the door is open, but not as the man who once chose silence over risk. Come as someone who is ready to listen, not lead. With hope, Amira." He read it twice, then sat down, and for the first time in years, he wept, not for his loss, but for the truth he had almost missed. Elsewhere, the world moved with the rhythm she had awakened. Music schools in New York, Tokyo, Nairobi, and Beirut created Amira scholarships for refugee children. Governments debated reforms on arts accessibility. In Brussels, a child performed the lullaby on a harmonica for parliament and was given a standing ovation. In Iran, a father carved his daughter a violin out of salvaged cedar and painted her name in gold. And in Rome, a new school opened, a sanctuary for young musicians displaced by war and poverty. Its walls were filled with laughter and missed notes, with improvisations and tears, with tiny fingers learning scales between bread and water breaks. At its heart, Amira taught. She taught quietly, without ego, without press. She never insisted on reverence, only honesty. Each child who entered her class was asked the same question. What do you remember when the world was silent? And from their answers, she helped them find their sound. One day, years later, a visitor arrived. He was older now, slower, dressed simply. It was Bellini. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching the children play music under a patchwork awning, some barefoot, some still learning the names of notes. He saw Amira across the yard, laughing with a child who couldn't speak but had just played his first melody. She looked up. Their eyes met. He placed a hand on his chest and nodded. Once. She smiled, then returned to her student. He didn't approach, didn't intrude, but he listened. At last. The sun was setting over Rome, casting long golden shadows across the rooftops where bells prepared to ring for evening prayer. From a distance, the Vatican stood as it always had, ancient, immovable, a crown of marble against the darkening sky. But something in the air felt different now, as if time itself had softened, as if the stone had learned to listen. Inside a small concert hall near the outskirts of the city, one not lined with statues or stained glass, but with crayon drawings taped to the walls, Amira stood at the back of a quiet classroom. Her students had gone home hours earlier. The room was still strewn with open instrument cases, scribbled sheet music, and a few leftover apples brought by parents too shy to speak in full sentences. She took it all in slowly, not with fatigue, but with awe. Every corner of the room was breathing. Every child who passed through it had left behind something invisible but unforgettable. A sound, a silence, a possibility. She walked toward the front, her shoes brushing over floorboards worn smooth by hundreds of hopeful feet. There, resting on a single chair, was her violin. Still the same one. Its varnish dulled with time, its scroll slightly chipped from that night on the boat. She traced her fingers along its neck, every curve a memory, every scratch a story. She hadn't performed publicly in over a year. Not because she'd withdrawn, but because she'd given everything she had to the ones who needed it more. The concerts weren't hers anymore. They belonged to the children who were now ready to sing their own truths, in rooms once closed to them, on stages that had finally opened. But tonight felt different. She didn't know why. Just that something was pulling her. Outside the window, the street was emptying, the city preparing to sleep. But in the courtyard, a small group of students had gathered, unplanned, barefoot, whispering to each other in the twilight. One of them, a girl with thick braids and a flute wrapped in a dish towel, knocked gently on the glass. "Amira," she called through the crack. "Will you play for us, just once?" Amira smiled softly. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the violin case, like someone reaching for a memory she wasn't sure she could carry. Then she opened it. The instrument gave a faint creak, a familiar sigh, as if waking from rest. She stepped outside barefoot, letting the warm stone of the courtyard kiss her soles, grounding her in the present. The children quieted. A few parents stood at the gate, watching from a distance. Above, laundry flapped from balcony lines like prayer flags. She didn't ask for silence. She didn't ask for permission. She simply raised the bow and began to play. Not the lullaby, not at first, but something gentler, a drifting melody that had no home, no title, something between a sigh and a sunrise. The notes floated upward like paper lanterns, glowing softly in the blue hour, wrapping around the children as they sat cross-legged, eyes wide, breathing as one. Somewhere in the back, Sister Eliana wiped her eyes without trying to hide it, and then, without warning, the melody shifted. It returned, the lullaby, her mother's song. It began low, the hum of a distant memory, and grew into the same aching rise that once stirred the stones of the Vatican. But this time it didn't carry sorrow. It carried peace. She played it not to be heard, but to remember. The children sat still. Some closed their eyes. One of the youngest reached for her brother's hand, and he held it gently, his thumb tapping to the rhythm. A breeze rustled the courtyard trees, and for a moment it sounded like the world was breathing in harmony. When the final note came, it did not fall. It landed like a kiss, like a promise. There was no applause, just stillness. And in that stillness, the world was whole. She lowered her violin, exhaled, and for the first time in years, truly smiled. It wasn't the smile of a girl who had been discovered. It was the smile of a woman who had come home to herself. She looked at the children. "Now you," she whispered. They picked up their instruments, one by one, out of tune, some too shy to begin. But eventually, the courtyard filled with mismatched melodies, laughter, and bold, untrained beauty. She sat among them, no longer the center, but part of the song. Elsewhere, the world carried on. Nations debated borders, headlines rose and fell. But beneath it all, in classrooms, in broken homes, in places no one filmed, her melody remained. A mother in Aleppo hummed it while wrapping her baby in a towel. A boy in Greece whistled it while walking alone past shuttered buildings. A violinist in Paris added it as a secret coda in her symphony. And somewhere in Rome, an old man, no longer a maestro, sat in a small chapel, humming it beneath his breath, a single candle flickering beside him. Years later, when people told the story of the girl who silenced the Vatican, they spoke of her as if she were a myth. A quiet miracle who arrived without warning, carrying music in her bones and a fire in her silence. But those who knew her never spoke of her with awe. They spoke of her with love, because the greatest thing she ever did wasn't play. It was believe. Believe that music didn't need a stage, that truth didn't need approval, and that a broken violin in the hands of a refugee child could heal the soul of the world. Sometimes, the most sacred music is born in silence, nurtured not in concert halls, but in the quiet ache of forgotten corners. Amira's story is not just about a refugee child with a broken violin. It's about the audacity to believe that you are worthy, even when the world shuts its doors. Her journey teaches us that talent doesn't require permission, that soul cannot be manufactured, and that a single act of courage, standing up with nothing but truth in your hands, can break centuries of silence. You don't have to come from privilege to be powerful. You don't need flawless technique to move hearts. You just need to hold on to the song inside you, even when others try to silence it. Because in the end, the most beautiful melodies are not those played perfectly, but those played honestly. Let this story be a reminder. Your voice matters. Your truth matters. And sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with a roar, but with a single trembling note.